or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I will be reading from Sunday's February 22nd issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This article is written by M. Gleason. Ukraine has passed a point of no return. In the middle of last Saturday of January, hundreds of people congregated on the frozen Dnipro River for a rave. Under the high noon sun, the world was white. The tall apartment blocks lining the riverbank, the unplowed boardwalks, and the flat, snow-covered expanse of ice. With a citywide curfew in effect, parties in Kiev have long moved to daytime hours. And with much of the city lacking in heat, it makes sense to gather outdoors. So adults of different ages, dressed in puffy coats of every color, baggy designer sweatpants, and chunky Uggs, had gathered through. There wasn't much dancing, perhaps because the battery-powered speakers weren't quite strong enough to blast music through the open air. There was, however, much mingling, some barbecuing, a lot of mulled wine, and at least one book burning of a Russian-language young adult novel. Kids in snowbanks slid down the steep, laid back over the ice, the river. When they skidded across the ice, they knocked over a few adults. After the music ended, as scheduled at 3 p.m., many of the travelers poured into a cafe overlooking the river. It was quintessential Kiev scene. Exaggerated large wine glasses on sturdy wooden tables, a seafood bar, a display of bottles, impeccable style and a commitment to enjoyment as resistance to the Russian onslaught. But a few minutes after the influx of customers, a waitress announced, "We have no order. I won't be taking orders." Seconds later, the electricity went off, taking the music and the lights with it and turning the oyster display case into dark gray boxes. Most of the customers left. The waiters vanished too, leaving dirty dishes on many tables. The cafe looked a movie set if the director shouts, "Cat out, cut," and the actors and crew disperse, exhausted. Kiev is tired. For most of the 4 years since Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the capital city has insisted on maintaining and restoring its usual vibrant urban life. Theaters have been operating, as have art galleries and museums, although permanent collections have been stowed away in safe locations. Universities and secondary schools have continued in-person instructions. Electric banks and scooters have been well maintained. The metro has kept running, and the railroad has served the city like clockwork. The railroads in particular has become a symbol of Ukrainian Nezlamist. That's Nezlaminst, invincibility, or literally unbreakability. But with Russia's attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, leaving people without light and heat for weeks on end, living a normal life has become unattainable. It is probably fair to say that there isn't a place or a person left in Ukraine who can forget about the war for even a few moments. People still try not to forget, but to continue living the best possible life every minute. After a short while, the waiters at the Riverside Cafe returned and cleaned the tables. New customers came in. Someone restored the generator, bringing the lights and the music back. Without running water, the place couldn't serve food, but there could still be and there was drinking. Soon the sun went down and the giant apartment blocks dissolved into the dark sky. Only a few windows flickered dimly, perhaps with the light of candles or lamps or a few battery-powered fixtures. February 24th marks the 4th anniversary of the full-scale invasion. 4 years is a particularly significant milestone for people who, like me, grew up in the Soviet Union in the eternal shadow of World War II, because 4 years was the duration of the fight against the Nazis. The number was seared into our minds, 4 years in which the Soviets fought what they call the Great Patriotic War. 4 years that created the country we lived in, its superpower status, its claim to world moral superiority. 4 years of death and displacement of tens of millions of people being called upon to sacrifice for their country's war effort. The slogan of those years was, "Everything for victory." Mila Tesh'avia, the photographer I work with on this story, and I were both raised, she in Kiev, I in Moscow, by parents who were born during the Great War. For us and so many people of our generation, the war explained why our grandfathers were absent. Our grandmas hoarded odd objects. Our parents had fraught relationships to food, and all of our family members seemed at all times to be in a state of hypervigilance. Most of all, the war explained why none of the plans for our grandparents had made for their future ever came true. In our generation, the future as a category continued to be suspect. Growing up, I never questioned the heroism and special status of Soviet society. It was only as an adult that I came to understand that the war, which ended 22 years before I was born, had recast public morality, valorizing single-minded commitment and self-sacrifice above all else, above happiness of human connection, of creativity, of freedom. Many Ukrainians, even those born after the country gained independence from Moscow rule in 1991, grew up with much of the same mythology of the Great Patriotic War. Ukraine, which was under German occupation for most of the war, lost 10 million folks. Mila's surveying grandparents, like mine, celebrated every anniversary of that war but almost never talked about what they had experienced. After the war, the Soviet authorities sent thousands of Ukrainians to the Gulag for suspected collaboration with the Germans, in many cases as what amounted to punishment, surviving the occupation. Ukrainians never forgot the injury. Both of those World War II stories of the heroism of Ukrainians and of the cruelty of Moscow inform the way Ukrainians think about the war they are fighting now. Newer works of history reframe the period as two sides of a coin. German and Soviet occupations of Ukraine, two empires that aimed to enslave Ukrainians. Germany during World War II, the Soviet Union before and after. And yet the number 4 has continued to be large in collective memory. Now Ukraine's patriotic war against Russia has crossed the threshold with no end in sight. Russia's offensive returned to speed up in December. In February, Ukraine recaptured ground in its most successful counter-offensive in more than 2 years. But on the whole, the front line has remained largely static for more than 3 years. Russia's apparently overwhelming superiority in manpower and military resource didn't bring about a swift victory, but neither have the resolve of the Ukrainian people and the Western aid they have received proves enough to stop Russian aggression. Whatever lies ahead feel as if it will last forever. Ukrainians have organized their lives accordingly. They are living the war in their work, their social lives, their waking and sleeping hours. It is a fundamental orientation of time and values and social relations that will define many future generations of Ukrainian life. By any measure, Ukraine is a profoundly different country now than it was 4 years ago. At the start of the full-scale invasion, excluding regions that were already occupied by Russia, it had a population of perhaps 36 million people, according to Timofey Bryk, a sociologist and rector of the Kyiv School of Economics. Other estimates tend to be higher. Since then, Bryk says, 6 million have been displaced inside the country, and some 4 million, mostly women and children, have left Ukraine. More than 100,000 Ukrainians, troops and civilians, are estimated to have been killed. Millions of people live under occupation in area Russia controls. When people were fleeing the Russian offensive in the winter of 2022, squeezing into overcrowded train cars headed west, few imagined that the war would go on for a long time. Either Russia's tremendous military might or the West's firm resolve would dictate a fast resolution, it seemed. But 4 years after that, and 13 months into the presidency of Donald Trump, who promised to bring the war to an end within 24 hours of his inauguration, there is no safe home for Ukrainian war refugees to return to. And there's less and less reason even to think about it. The people who stayed in Western Europe have adapted to their new homes and to the separation from whom they left behind. What kind of relationship can we have with them over there and me back here? Taras Volosakashenko said when I asked him about the state of his marriage. He got his wife and 2 children out of Irpin, one of the Kiev suburbs, then under Russian occupation on March 2022. The wife and kids live in Switzerland now. He has visited once. She spent a life there, he said. The kids speak French to each other, and I don't understand. Like many Ukrainians who remain in the country, Volosakashenko has lived several different lives in the past 4 years, lives that he has shared with his parents and some of his friends, but not with his wife and children. Before the full-scale invasion, Voskolenko was a yoga instructor and a member of the Irpin City Council, position he still holds. During the weeks in 2022, when part of Irpin was occupied, he spent every day helping people escape the town. When Russian troops retreated from the Kiev region, Vyshenko joined the effort to identify the bodies of people killed in urban and neighborhood Bucha, which has become synonymous with Russian war crimes. People killed during the occupation had been buried in private yards and group graves in town parks, often after their bodies were left for days, wherever the killing had occurred. Vyshenko and others exhumed the bodies, interviewed loved ones and witnesses, and tried to match remains to description. After several months of this work, Volosakashenko became obsessed. He and his colleagues had been able to identify more than 400 bodies, but several dozen remained. Volosakashenko couldn't sleep. He couldn't think of anything else. He kept unzipping the black bags in which the bodies were kept, or what remained of them after several months in morgues that didn't consistently have electricity. An editorial comment: in spite of our polarization, when you read about what's going on in Ukraine and from this article, you're really appreciative of living in America. And I think of the poor people in the cold when you go to bed at night and you're chilly and you pull the covers up a little higher. It took the intervention of visiting mental health professionals for Vashchenko to get help. He worked on setting up therapy centers for survivors of Russian aggression in different parts of Ukraine. And then last year, at the age of 46, he enlisted. He thinks that everyone should. To be clear, not everyone agrees. After an initial wave of volunteers immediately after the full-scale invasion, the Ukrainian armed forces have struggled to conscript enough people who enlisted 4 years ago and who are still physically able to serve have been unable to leave the service. Meanwhile, enlistment officers stage daily raids of Ukrainian cities, apprehending potential conscripts and delivering them to military bases. Some escaped at the same time of this vast in particular. I heard many stories of people who either choose to enlist or submitted to a conscription raid and found peace in the service and no longer trying to evade it. Vashchenko thinks that is as it should be, and that those who cannot serve at the front should join the war effort in the rear. He complained that after several years of pooling money for the war effort, parents groups have resumed collection for gifts and flowers for teachers. That strikes him as frivolous, as does any pretense of peacetime life. As an example of proper realistic adjustments, he cited the school kids of Kharkiv, many of which have permanently moved to underground bunkers. Underground schools have become symbols of Ukrainian unbreakability, along with warming tents set up in the shadow of unheated high-rises. I visited the Kiev School of Economics, a small, ambitious private university that has managed to draw some outstanding academic talent from Ukraine and the West. Brick, the rector, excitingly made to the basement where the university has created several classrooms complete with whiteboards. The school schedules only as many classes can simultaneously convene in the bunker, so that whatever the raid alarm sounds, as it does on almost days, classes can move down below. The brick showed me something else he was proud of: a classroom equipped for a vocational training program. This one in soldiering, a skill newly demand in the growing drone industry. Most recently, Brick told me, the university has moved dozens of students out of apartment buildings and it lost power and heat into the hotel rooms. I wonder what, with his ingenuity and energy, he would be capable of in peacetime. Russia's war, a war for the return to an imperial past, has always been a war against Ukraine's future. I imagine after we're in a war, I'd be getting another PhD in neurobiology. Another acquaintance, Lena Semolenko, told me her first PhD is in mathematics, multidimensional spaces to be exact. She got it before Russia annexed Crimea, and Russian-backed forces occupied the small town in the east where she had grown up. When the phase of the war began in 2014, Smolenko was 28 and living in Kiev. She started volunteering, helping some people to escape the Russians and others to survive under occupation. She spent many years organizing aid and reporting about the war. And then it came to Kiev. It's Groundhog Day every day, she said. You had your ear to the ground every day, listening for tanks. It was only later that night that I realized that it was in fact Groundhog Day, February 2nd. It was also 4 years to the day since I first wrote about Semolenko. Back then I had come to Kiev, a city I had often visited, to cover its preparation for the Russian invasion. I had sought out Semolenko because she had written a Facebook post decrying the idea that anyone can adequately prepare for war, while most people she knew were packing go bags and laying in supplies to survive a short-term crisis. Semolenko was girding herself and her family for a more fundamental change. In 2022, Samolenko started to help out in Kherson, a port city in southern Ukraine that spent more than 6 months under occupation. After Russian troops retreated, remaining residents, a disproportionate number of them poor and old and disabled, needed basic supplies, medicine, and care. Samolenko raised money, recruited volunteers, bought a car, and set up shop in working-class neighborhoods of the city. In June of 2023, Russian forces apparently blew up the nearby Karakovom Dam, unleashing a deadly flood. Such created even more need for Samolenko's work. Meanwhile, her marriage ended and her ex-husband, a poet and musician, joined the military. Even if he hadn't joined up, he might have met a younger woman, Samolenko said. It's just that the war has brought going for such a long time, long enough for people to fall in and out of love, among other things. It's been going on so long, and the war itself has changed in profound ways. It started with bomber plants and tanks, but it's continuing primarily with drones. And the drone technology keeps changing. Military personnel have had to train and retrain. So have journalists. On a Sunday afternoon, Mila and I attended a training session for journalists at a former Soviet young pioneer camp outside Kiev. A group of people who became war correspondents 4 years ago. Before that, many of them wrote about politics or social issues or produced movies, were learning how to direct and avoid drones. They look for cover, pursued by devices and beehives like him, but how can you dodge weapons that are capable of turning corners, hovering in wait, and going into open doors and windows? At one point, a journalist dropped to her knees in the snow and yelled, "That's it, I'm fucked." Excuse the language, listeners, but I'm just reading what the article says. The drones made it harder for Samolenko to continue working in Kherson. She could no longer use the car because drones would follow the few vehicles traveling in the city's largely deserted back roads, and the distance she needed to cover were too great to travel by foot regularly. So she too joined the military. The day we made up, she had been promoted to staff sergeant. "Let's drink to that," she said, in a way that made it clear that this wasn't a milestone she ever hoped to celebrate. In her past life, Samolenko was a prominent figure in Kiev's cultural scene. She organized poetry festival, and she loved to dress up for events. And I'm spending the last years of my youth in a dimly lit office space with people I wouldn't ordinarily choose to socialize with. Like other service members, Samolenko can't tell exactly what she does, but she is based in Kiev, a couple of 100 miles from the active fighting, which means that she doesn't get supplemental frontline pay. From her own life, she still has her remote job as a consultant, which allow her to rent an apartment near her base and some floor-length velvet dresses that she keeps in a closet is something like a talisman. Someday she hopes to wear them again, to travel, to walk by the sea. Those are the things she needs to feel happy. While we talked, Ukrainian, American, and Russian representatives continued their endless negotiations. Negotiations about negotiations that Trump kept promising would bring an end to the war. Meanwhile, 2025 had been the deadliest war for civilians since the war started. The Americans said the Russians had agreed to stop hitting Ukrainian energy for a week. The agreement didn't hold. It's been so cold for the last month that you keep feeling that it must warm up soon. Samolenko said. But there is still February and March in Kiev. It's cold, too. There's no reason to think that it will get warmer, and nothing gets easier, even though we've been through so much. Even the catastrophic early days of the full-scale invasion felt more hopeful, she said. The way we think about the future is also usually the way we think about the past. The inescapable sense that this war is forever has compelled Ukrainians to reframe their history, including the history of World War II, as one eternal war against Russia. I saw and heard this narrative seemingly everywhere on the visit, including in Independence Square in the center of Kiev, long site of memorials, both permanent and makeshift. For years, there were memorials to revolution, particularly those of the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Revolution Dignity in 2014, for which the square served as the main stage. But the memorials currently on display in the square tell a different story. There is an exhibit devoted to the 1991 protests against the Soviet regime, now reframed as a revolt against Russian imperialism, a permanent memorial to the people who died in 2014, both during the revolution and the war in the East, and a growing memorial to the Ukrainian fighters who have died since 2022, each of them marked with a small Ukrainian flag. What struck me most about the current memorials in its scale, there is a multitude of flags that most are tiny, guaranteeing that the memorial can keep expanding for a long time. Paradoxically, thinking of the war as eternal gives Ukraine some room for negotiating with Russia and gives Ukrainians a modicum of hope. No one expects the current negotiations to bring permanent peace, but a truce that gives Russia domain over parts of eastern Ukraine may be acceptable when one compares it with the outcome of World War II, the Russian occupation of all of contemporary Ukraine, including lands that had belonged to Poland before the war. If the war is eternal, it must also be all-encompassing, just as Taras Vasilokoshenko told me. All of Ukrainian is the front. The country's westernmost major city, Lviv, which has been subject to only intermittent assault, has enshrined itself into a city that visibly lives and breathes the war. A large stand in Market Square, updated every morning at 9, displays the photos and biographies of soldiers who would be buried that day, typically at 11. Cars carrying flag-draped coffins put up in the St. Peter and Paul Garrison Church, one of the largest houses of worship in the city. A military band assembles in front and play coffins are loaded back into the vehicles. They are driven to Market Square, where the mayor of Lviv pays his respect. As a trumpeter dressed in red plays Il Senzio by Naomi Roscoe, wrote by Nini Rosso every day. But perhaps the biggest change the war has brought to Lviv, I think it's pronounced, it's Lviv, is that the city has become a world capital of amputations and prosthetics. Together, centers with names like Unbroken Superhumans serve thousands of people at a time. In all, some 100,000 Ukrainians are estimated to have lost limbs in this war so far. Whoa. Let me read that again. 100,000 Ukrainians have lost limbs. At Unbroken, I walked down a hallway filled with photographs and architectural renderings of rehab centers, vocational training schools, new surgical clinics, and on, that the organization recently built or plans to build. At Superhuman, I heard about centers of organizations opening in other cities, including one in Odessa that's being built partly underground. The centers are, of course, proud of their work, their technology expertise, their range of rehabilitation, the speed in which they get people standing and walking and being self-sufficient again. As superhumans, I interviewed two of the men who seemed preternaturally cheerful, full of hope for the future. Both were fairly newly in love. Each of them were missing both legs above the knee. One because a rocket hit the trench where he was operating a machine gun. The other because an attack caused the loaded drone he was carrying to explode in his hands. So this man is also missing one hand. This war, like the Great War before it, has extracted and normalized extraordinary sacrifice. It demands that everyone serve and everyone be a hero. I talked with an attorney who said he was defending more than 50,000 of people accused of collaboration with the Russians. Some, he said, because they didn't resist occupiers who entered their houses. Others because they continued to run business under occupation and pay taxes to the occupying authorities. War poses impossible choices, Samolenko said, like when are you fleeing the advancing Russian troops? Whether to force your grandma who has dementia to come with you, and then you have to live with that choice, whatever the decision that you made. War turns writers and artists and engineers and house painters into soldiers. And when people come back from the war, they are going to want to have a say in how the country is run. Anto Liagusha, chair of the newly formed master's program in memory studies and public history at the Kiev School of Economics, told me some of them will be government. And in the history of the world, I am not aware of any cause of a country that is run by military officers that is democratic. This is the most painful irony forced by the war. Ukrainians rose up against Russian aggression in order to protect their democracy. By any measure, one of the most vibrant and robust in the past Soviet space. But over 4 years of martial law and military censorship, suspected elections, mobilization, both legal and psychological, Ukraine has become progressively less democratic. This was part of the Russians' goal. In the course of the war, I've heard Ukrainians talk less about democracy. It's understandable. This is a war of independence and everything else is secondary. But in many ways, Ukrainians have never been less independent from Russia. It's Russia that determines when and if Ukrainians sleep, whether they can move through the cities, and whether they have running water and light and heat. In Lviv, I met Mariana Mamarova, who works as a therapist at the Unbroken Center. She began the war as a military doctor in Mariupol, where she worked through the first couple of months of the stage of the city. In April 22nd, just weeks after she learned she was pregnant, she was taken prisoner. She spent almost 7 months in a notorious Russian prisoner camp near occupied Ukraine city of Olenivka before being released as part of a prisoner exchange. Less than a week later, Maramova gave birth. She retrained as a therapist, and the skills she learned, she told me, saved her life and her marriage. When I told Mira Tanova that I was trying to describe Ukrainians' current predicament, she compared it to being a prisoner of war. It is kind of a captivity, she said. You are in bondage. Russia tortures its prisoners with cold, and hunger. And here it is the same, continuing compassion. She likened Kiev, where many apartments have no heat or electricity, and almost no one has enough to solitary confinement, not because Kiev is isolated, but because it's a place where even more people are suffering from the cold than elsewhere in the country. Yet another round of U.S.-led negotiations on the Russian-Ukrainian war was in the planning stage. A day before Mamaronova and I talked, Russia had violated the ostensible temporary ban on targeting the energy. Kiev has spent much of the previous 24 years without electricity and under an air raid alert. Wasn't the first such day, or the second, or the fifth, and it wasn't clear that everyone outside Ukraine took much notice. This too reminded Mamamonova of Russian captivity. You scream, and no one can hear you. Whew. Editorial comment. That's an outstanding article. And I guess where we sit here, I'm reading this in a heated cubicle. I guess we really can have no feel of what those poor folks are going through, and they have negotiations. All they do is talk, talk, talk. Next article is written by Jamal Bowie. Rubio is failing Western civilization. Americans of the revolutionary generation did not think of themselves as direct heirs to Western civilization, a term that wouldn't come into vogue until the 20th century. If anything, they saw their new nation as a break with the European past, a new civilization rooted in popular sovereignty and Republican self-government. The independence of America considered merely as a separation from England and had been a matter but of little importance. Thomas Paine observed in the early 1790s, had it not been accompanied by a revolution in the principles and practice of government. In 1793, National Chapman, a Vermont jurist and veteran of the Revolutionary War, put it a little differently. The government of the United States exhibits a new scene in the political history of the world. Decades later, Lincoln made the distinction in more abstract form in the Gettysburg Address, elevating the United States as the one place where humanity could learn whether a new nation, conceived in liberty, could long endure, or whether governments of the people, by the people, for the people, would perish from the earth. In the second term, President Trump has held himself and his administration out as a bulwark in defense of Western civilization, the last best hope for the grand heritage of the West against lawless incursion from foreign others. In this Western civilization, Secretary of State Marco Rubio explained in his address to the Munich Security Conference last month, rests on a pillar built on ethic and religious nationalism and a rigid sovereignty, backed by hard borders and a jealous contempt for international cooperation. In his speech, he decried an unprecedented wave of mass migration that threatens the cohesion of our societies, the continuity of our culture, and the future of the people. It should be said that this formation makes no particular sense for the United States, a pluralistic, polyglot nation that has throughout its history sustained profound levels of immigration from countries around the world. In fact, Rubio's formulation begins to make real sense only when you see his idea of our people is narrow and exclusive. We are bound to one another by deepest bonds that nations could share, Rubio said, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together for the common civilization to which we have fallen heir. This, again, is a strange claim to make of either the United States or especially Europe, a region that homes to dozens of cultures and language whose history is practically defined by centuries of catastrophic ethnic and religious conflict, whose divisions produced two of the most destructive wars in human history, and whose national and linguistic identities relatively modern inventions dating to the 17th and 18th, 19th century. This version is a singular Western heritage extending to the American present, of a civilization defined by common tongue, shared belief, and hierarchy of value, does bear an interesting relationship to the imagined feudal Europe that shaped the political imagination of Southern slave owners in the decades before the Civil War. Part of what this entailed ideological was a rejection of the Declaration of Independence, both as a statement of equality and as a decisive break in the past. C.J. Calhoun of South Carolina, who served briefly as Secretary of State under John Tyler, was a pro-slavery political theorist, condemned Jefferson's proposition that all men are created equal as a hypothetical truism, and in practice the most false and dangerous of all political errors. The truth as he saw it was that American civilization extended out from the old world, an inheritance reserved for those who could claim the mantle of whiteness. It is here in this antipathy toward the egalitarian and universalist elements of the American founding that has the connection between the antebellum feudal obsession and the Trump administration version of sovereignty in Western civilization becomes clear, if not obvious. Both are tied to a racial and religious conception of culture and bound up in the notion of human hierarchy. The one people threatened by migration in the United States and Europe by Ruby on Trump's account are people of direct European descent, shorn of their particular histories, and presented as a single imagined whole. In other words, as white first and foremost. And for the larger MAGA right, as it was for the slaveholder radicals, the Declaration of Independence and its powerful version of human equality stands as one of the chief obstacles in its effort to consummate its vision of domination and exclusion. Writing in 1859, Lincoln commented on there in his time who dispatched Jefferson words accusing them of supplanting the principles of free government and restoring those of classification and caste. Today we have a movement that sees it as an aim, the destruction of what has been in the American tradition, a movement that, as Lincoln would delight a convocation of crowned heads against the people. Next article was written by Nicholas Kristof. What trafficked girls think of Epstein. As the world follows the drip of sensational revelations about Jeffrey Epstein, here's a number to ponder. Last year, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received more than 113,000 reports of child sex trafficking. Let's repeat that. 113,000 reports about sex trafficking. Yehuda Suras, the center's chief legal official, says that while no one knows the actual number of children trafficked annually, in the United States alone, the real number is absolutely higher than that. Most victims reported to organizations are 15, 16, or 17, she said. Some are as young as 11 or 12. This is happening in every community, in every city and state, she added. I've been speaking with survivors of sex trafficking and those who work with them, and they're thrilled that the Epstein files are bringing more attention to trafficking. But there's also frustrated that the focus has been tightly on Epstein and his circles, and not on the victims or the way we are a society unable to abuse. We rightly condemn powerful associates of Epstein's of their indifference to young girls being sexually assaulted. But collectively, we show the same indifference in a way that I fear leaves us complicit. If you told me 20 years ago that the word trafficking and the concept that it would be on the nightly news every single night and by the national obsession, I wouldn't have believed you. Rachel Lloyd, who was trafficked as a teenager and once was nearly strangled to death by her pimp, told me, but it's bizarre to me that they were having a national conversation about trafficking, and yet it hasn't made a difference. Lloyd, who now runs GEMS GEMS, an outstanding program for trafficked young women and girls, said of the increased attention, "It's not elevating the lives of my young women. It's not shining light on their vulnerabilities and the things that they go through or their gaps in the system. It's not doing any of that. It's terrific to see the scrutiny of Epstein's world, and I hope that there'll be investigations of allegations made against President Trump and many others, even as we acknowledge that for now they're lacking evidence. If Britain can't arrest the former Prince Andrew and Norway can charge a former prime minister, how is it that the United States has barely taken action?" Lloyd says that it is not surprised that Epstein friends appear to have gotten away with raping children. In her experience and that of the girls she was worked with, she said predators almost always get away with their abuse. Why is there so little accountability? In part, it's that when we see girls who have been trafficked, they're not changed in dungeons or being held at gunpoint. Rather, they're often wearing provocative clothes, seeking customers, so we assume that this is their choice and move on. Yet remember that the average age of minors who are trafficked, one study found, is 15. Most are runaways, and often these kids have good reasons to flee their homes. You can't just look at someone and say, "Oh, she must be promiscuous," Tiffany Simpson told me, "and she should know, for she has felt those stares and endured the stigma." Simpson grew up in a chaotic household. She said that her dad was in prison for murder. Her mom wrestled with alcoholism, and that a relative sexually assaulted her. That a relative sexually assaulted her. So she ran away from home at 16 and into the arms of a pimp who exploited her. That's often what happens, and usually the only people looking for hungry, scared runaways at bus stations are not social workers, but pimps. The police and prosecutors often have other priorities. I once visited in Boston the frightened parent of a 15-year-old ninth grader who ran away from home 3 months earlier. They were frantic, but the police had been unhelpful. I pulled out my laptop in their dining room, and in 2 minutes I found an online for a mixed Latina catering to your needs, and with photos of a semi-nude girl. The mother screamed. It was her daughter. I passed on the ad and the pimp's phone number to the Boston police. They raided the hotel where the pimp was keeping the girl. He went to prison, but this should have happened much earlier. If we actually want to help prevent the next Jeffrey Epstein, there are several things we can do. For starters, we can improve the broken foster care system. Only about 4% of foster children end up earning a BA, and 4/5 of the trafficked girls helped by GEMS have been in foster homes. Maybe that girl in foster care is more likely to be trafficked than she's to graduate from college. That's an interesting statistic. 4/5, 80% of the trafficked girls came from foster homes. We should also create accountability by aggressively prosecuting traffickers. Indeed, I fear that we're retreating. There has been little outcry as Trump has diverted federal law enforcement from catching child predators so the officers could take part in his immigration crackdown. Accountability means prosecuting not only traffickers but also anyone who buys sex from a child. Why doesn't this happen? The police and prosecutors sometimes don't have much empathy for the girls, who in fairness may curse their would-be rescuers. While the Johns may include prospective businessmen, teachers, officials, most communities don't have the stomach to arrest people. And that's not on Epstein or his associates. That's on us. Our leaders are not us. Before leaving for the airport to catch my flight to Milan, I bought one full-size American flag, 4x8 by 12-inch flag. They have two backup smaller flags just in case. Then, because of Minneapolis, because of U.S. Olympic officials led to change the name of the athlete hangout from Ice House to Winter House. Because of the Dunroe Doctrine, and because many Americans, including some Olympians, are struggling with what it means to represent and root for their country right now, I wonder how comfortable I should be about waving them. Maybe I could try turning the Stars and Stripes upside down, the way Martha Ann Alito did shortly after Joe Biden had been elected president. Did I need to invent some kind of semaphore to convey support for Team USA, combined with opposition to annexing Greenland or Canada? I needn't have worried, even though we're in the stance towards zero-sum competition among nations. I can't imagine a stronger rebuke of nationalism than the one that was delivered by fans at this year's Winter Olympics. I don't mean to suggest that the sports will bring the world together, and certainly not the Olympics. The 2018 Pyeongchang Games brought North and South Korea no closer to reconciliation. The 2022 Beijing Games very likely delayed Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine by less than 1 week. Indeed, whenever my wife and I enter Olympic venues, we witnessed unfussy, entirely organic displays of the difference between patriotism and nationalism. Thousands of people all cheering locally for their countries and recognition others' right to their equally loud for their matters. The spirit inside the venues was one the TV broadcast often alludes but can't fully capture. Yet one nation's thrill of victory is another's agony of defeat. Yet the drive for excellence that the Olympics celebrate, and the courage and the triumph and heartbreak of the men and women who compete them, speak to the elements of the human condition that effortlessly crossed borders. This desire for shared global experience defies a nationalistic retrenchment on the rise throughout the world, and the disdain for long-standing alliances that became a hallmark of President Trump's foreign policy. 2 days after Chancellor Friedrich Merz of Germany warned the Munich Security Council that the United States claimed leadership had been challenged and possibly lost, we were bonding as an international assortment of fans in the nosebleed seats of the Milano Arena. People can tell the difference. Our leaders, however misguided, are not us. America is not just an idea, said Mr. Vance at the right-wing Claremont Institute here. We're a particular place with a particular people, with a particular set of beliefs and way of life. In a certain way, this is obviously the issue. At the men's 1,500-meter short track, I rooted for American speed skaters, Dutch people for Dutch ones. But the way Mr. Vance and said his MAGA allies extend the claim to argue that our distinct national culture is part of what makes international institutions suspect, immigration threatening, and alliances based on shared principles and whys, is belied by what people spend time happily consuming, a swirly pop culture, from K-pop, Damon, or Bad Bunny to Ballerina Cappuccino to this year's scheduling Grand Theft Auto 6 release. If the old geopolitical order is not coming back, as Prime Minister Mark Cheney of Canada warned recently, the global culture order that rose alongside it isn't going anywhere. On Thursday night, the loudest cheers I heard were for Alicia Louise' powerful, mesmerizing, joyous, life-affirming gold medal-winning free skate. But before that, the audience got nearly as loud for the Swiss skater, Kimi Rippon, who finished second to last. Rippon had just fallen for a second time. Her chance to set a season's personal best, let alone to win a medal, had vanished. Yet, judging by the crowd's reaction, she got back to her feet and resumed skating. You could have thought that she won the championship of the world. There were at least a dozen nationalities representing us in the stands that night. It's something that tied us together, other than a desire to see our own athletes win, of course, was a shared belief that at difficult times, there's nothing more impressive, nothing more Olympian than figuring out a way to muddle through. With our wallets, our attention, our time, and our collective groans, with every fall and cheers for every newly realized lifelong dream. The world citizens realized a lifelong dream. The world citizens are sending a message. We proudly root for our countries, but we are more than just our countries. And in many cases, we are better, much better, than the governments in charge of them. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday's February 22nd issue of the New York Times opinion section. We read from the New York Times opinion section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader's been Dick Shanley. Thanks for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another